Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 93, and today we're going to be talking about drafting WoE. And by drafting, I mean literally, I'm going to focus on the draft portion only, not on the outcomes of the games. There is going to be some win rate, of course, because I'm going to link draft choices to certain win rates, but it's going to be purely focused on the draft portion. Before we go into that, obviously, I would like to thank people who are helping me with the stream, and these are the patrons. No new patrons to report this week, but hopefully some will appear soon. But I thank existing patrons, and I would like to thank tgazone.com, who are patiently waiting for me to deliver any articles, but I'm woefully short on time recently. I'm planning to start writing them very soon, so I'm having a plan of a couple of like those deep dive articles that are linked to the format but not format specific. So I'm going to write about things that should be universal for every set, but they will be based on the data I got from WoE and then possibly the next set. And with that, we can move to the preamble. And this week, preamble is super exciting. So if you don't know, but it's hard not to know if you are following any kind of magic news, there's been a new episode of heuristic studies, and I'm on it, and there's plenty of me, and I'm super proud of that, and I'm super fortunate to be there. And I mean, this has been a project that was in the making for the last 2 months. I kept it under wraps. There were some hints dropped. Those of you that follow very carefully what's going on notice that Sam from heuristic studies made a couple of hints, and my graphs were there, and allegedly they're so characteristic that some people figured out that I might be involved. I'm talking about the Dominaria United draft and how this format was slightly different, and Sam linked it all with literature theory, and as always gave it a super deep connection to a general humanity, which is something I never do. I always focus on the draft, and I don't do any kind of other philosophical dives. So it was nice to see my data analysis set in a context of not only a format, but also of a general approach of humanity towards data visualization. I thought it was super cool. So as my preamble, I'm just going to urge you to watch it and enjoy it, because truly this has been something I think is enjoyable, not only if you're a drafter, but also if you just like magic and would like to, get a bit more information about something that is maybe not obvious. So yeah, I had loads of fun doing it, even though my involvement was shockingly minimal considering how much I feature in the episode. But yeah, I'm super glad to see it finally and sit back and enjoy my humble content in this, behemoth of magic content creation that heuristic studies is. Okay, enough self-bragging. I already feel too cocky. I need to humble myself down with maybe less pleasant things. And the less pleasant things is I received many questions from my patrons that I didn't answer. There were good reasons why I didn't answer them. One was that I didn't know how to answer some of them. Two was that in the last episodes, one of them was an episode with a guest, and I usually don't do patron questions during my guest episodes. And three is because I was a lazy git, and I moved around the episodes, so there was a small gap between them. But now, because of that, I'm going to answer several of them in order to make sure that my patrons are happy that I'm answering their question. And the first question, that was the one that I was really struggling with for a very long time, and I didn't even know how to analyze it. But the question was, it was about scrying. It was still in the context of Lord of the Rings, although it was asked after the format finished. But it was about bottoming cards. By bottoming, I mean putting them at the bottom of the library. And the question was, does bottoming certain types of card impact your win rate? Specifically, it was asking, if you put too much removal on the bottom of your library by scrying because you don't need it at the moment, is it going to impact your win rate? And question was by Mike. And I don't know how to even measure it, because even the replay data does not contain the calculations of card that were put on the bottom of the library. So I can't really access that data. However, the fact that there is no data doesn't mean that there are no answers. And the answers can be implied from other other inquiries that we did. And one inquiry that was time and time again repeated and shown is that cards that give you more choices are benefiting better players. If you watch the Ristic Studies episode, one card that I gave an example of in that particular interview was Impulse. With Impulse, 2 mana, look at top 4 cards, pick one of those cards, put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library. When you think about it, Impulse is not that different from scrying. So you look at some cards, and you don't draw one of them, but you do rearrange them in your library. And the more scry you have, like scry 1, you have a simple choice. Do I want to keep it or do I not want to keep it? Scry 2 already makes multiple additional possible choices. You can bottom both cards. You can keep them on top in particular order. You can keep one on top. You can keep the other on top. And of course, there are 2 orders. You can keep them on top. And this, of course, means that there's more options. And since we have shown in the data that better players, the ones with higher win rate, will benefit from those cards disproportionately more compared to, like if the difference in win rates between top players and the mid-tier players is like 7 percentage points, cards that have those multiple choices will have maybe 9 percentage points different instead of 7, and it's going to be consistent. So my idea of that would be that all the scry kind of effects, the more cards you're looking at through them are going to be disproportionately benefiting those players with high win rates, because they will know how to arrange them, and they will arrange them correctly more percentage of the time. So I can't tell you if it impacts your win rate in a way of the act of bottoming certain types of card, but I can tell you that any spell that will let you scry multiple cards is going to be more beneficial to high win rate players and less beneficial to low win rate players. Being able to prioritize cards when they are being scried is something that you learn along as you play more and more games. And if you want to become better at that, watch the streamers in the formats that do have a lot of scrying. Go back to the archive recordings of Jason, who is in the chat, and watch them arrange stuff after casting Imperial Oath, and listen to the rationales they give. And then you will learn more stuff than I can offer you from the data analysis. Sometimes data cannot have an answer, and every time that data doesn't have an answer, I'm sending people straight to practitioners. Also, if the data has an answer, it's always good to watch practitioners, and it's always good to watch how true masters of the game are thinking and what is the decision process behind them. And streaming, of course, provides that kind of perfect vehicle for doing that. So that was a question from Mike. But that's not the last question. That's not even, well, that's second last question. There's 2 more. That was a question from my new patron, well, new-ish, no longer than a month, Gregorado. Thank you very much for becoming a patron. And because when you become a patron, even if you're in the wrong tier to ask the listener question time, I'm still giving 1 freebie to the new patrons. And basically, Gregorado is riding that train. Very smart decision. Lots of people didn't even ask the question, even though they could. I'm not judging. I'm just saying, if you can ask, ask. That's what I will always do. His question is, or their question is, does mulliganing patterns in WoE look different from other sets? Again, it's very hard to answer with data for a very trivial reason. It's been mulligans. There was issue of how logs recorded mulligans in the last 3 sets. So there is no good data on mulligans in the last 3 sets. And I honestly didn't feel like going way back is going to be very helpful, because memory of the sets beyond the last 4 might be a bit blurred. So instead of that, I looked a bit into mulligan patterns in WoE. Like, first thing that I noticed is, weirdly, and I don't know if it's just a data quirk or is it a trend, but white-red decks mulligan way more than any other type of decks. I looked at the 17 lands users mulligan rate. It's 14% for white-red, and it's around 12% for most of the decks. And 3 of the sort of control archetypes. Next week, we're going to be talking about which decks are control, which decks are super aggro, and how you can select right cards for those decks. I already did half of the analysis. That's how efficient I was this week. But black, green, blue, green, and blue, red, 3 decks that prefer to play a longer game, maybe to surprise of someone, especially blue, red doesn't seem like that deck. They mulligan less. So yeah, Rosemary T says, doesn't seem too weird. No low drops equals mulligan in red-white. That's true, but I would also say the same about black-red. And black-red has a solid 2 percentage points different in the mulligan rate. So it might be even that white-red has maybe the highest need for 1-drops, and maybe that's even the problem. But it's worth noting that it's there. It still might be a quirk of the data. It might be an outlier. The sample sizes on those things are not that huge, but they are big enough that I would expect that maybe there is like 1% error. So even with that 1% error, it would still seem that the white-red has slightly elevated mulligan rate by the 17 land users, and it doesn't hurt the win rate of the deck in general that much. It's still one of the highest winning archetypes, if not the highest. So then I decided to look at the cost of mulliganing of those decks. I looked at the generic win rate from the dataset I analyzed, the win rate when you mulligan, and also the win rate when your opponent mulligans. So these are basically are ordered in order. That doesn't look like from the graph, obviously, but there is a madness to this method. It's ordered from the biggest difference between generic win rate and the win rate on mulligan to the smallest difference between generic win rate and the win rate on mulligan. So when you look at those, white-green is the one that is most punished by mulliganing. You lose like 16 percentage points of your win rate. You go from 54 to 39%. Then you have black-red from 57.5 to 42.5 roughly percent win rate. And then we have like white-red, white-black. So like Mardu colors generally don't mulligan as well, but those differences are not big. And then you move through the archetypes until you reach blue-red and blue-green, which are not only the ones that mulligan the least, but also have a smallest punishment for mulliganing in terms of win rate. So if it's 16 percentage point for white-green, it's only like 12 percentage points for blue-green. So 4 percentage points different in terms of win rate when you mulligan. Of course, the problem with the blue-green is that it has a pretty much low win rate if you don't mulligan, and that's the biggest obstacle in playing blue-green. I'm thinking, so Jason in the chat says, so what you're saying is blue-green and blue-red should mulligan more. It's possible that those decks don't mulligan enough. They could maybe mulligan a bit more and increase their win rate by not keeping hands that are potentially losing. But I think that there is this rather common knowledge that if you're playing an aggressive deck and you don't have early drops, you should mulligan it. But there are maybe no clear heuristics of what to do when you're playing a control game and how you should mulligan. And control decks in general are already harder to play than the aggro decks. So there's like a double whammy. And that's why I sometimes think that the data is slightly artificially undermining the win rates of control decks, because if you have a large population of players and you give them aggro decks and you give them the control decks, I think on average the quality of the play with the aggro decks is going to be higher, which means that the control decks are going to have a slightly lowered win rate compared to how powerful they are in the vacuum if Sparky would play them or something. And you can sort of guess it a bit by looking at the top player data from 17 lands, when usually the thing that you observe in looking at the top player data is that those control decks perform much better than they do in the generic data. So there is a hint of the fact that 17 lands data might artificially lower the win rates of controlling archetypes, the ones that rely on playing a longer game. And here we have the same thing as I discussed with scrying. The longer the game, the more decision you make. The more decision need to be made in a game, the more likely you're to be making a mistake. And don't get me wrong, this is something that I employ in my own game style. I'd rather play decks that play shorter game because I know that in the long game, the probability of me making some kind of a complete blunder is probably 1. So I naturally tend to play games that take shorter, or at least take over the board to such extent that I'm having an unassailable advantage relatively quickly. I'm fine in finding lethal as long as I'm the advantage player, but if I have to play 15 turns on the back foot, I'm surely going to mess something up. But okay, so this is the part on the mulligans. I also looked at the difference between mulliganing on the play and mulliganing on the draw. I looked at the win rate of all decks without the mulligan. On the play, it's around 60%. On the draw, it's around 54% for all the players in 17 lands data set that I analyzed. So roughly 6 percentage points difference between play and draw for the 17 lands users only in this particular case. That's why the average is over 50%. Then when you look at the mulligan, on the play, it's 42%, and on the draw, it's 40%. So only 2 percentage points difference, or 2.5 percentage point difference between those two, which means that on the draw, you're slightly less punished by taking a mulligan. You're, of course, already punished for being on the draw. Unfortunately, in this format, there is quite a large difference between being on the draw and on the play. Funnily enough, no one complained about it as much as they did in a set that had very similar numbers called Phyrexia OB1, which is my pet complaint. I think that people complain about random things because they just don't like something, and they can feel that they don't like it. They just don't know if they have a good reason for not liking it, and they just pick a first reason that comes to mind. In this set, I didn't hear complaints about being on the play being so beneficial, but you can see quite a large difference between the win rate on the play and on the draw. But the good news is that mulliganing on the draw is not as punishing as mulliganing on the play. And it's quite a large difference. So yeah, 7.5 or 17.5 percentage points of drop in win rate when you're on the play and you mulligan, and only 14% when you're on the draw. Okay, that covers the mulligan question. And last question I'm going to talk about, because I thought it was a very cute question and also interesting, is how many 5+ drops should I play with Up the Beanstalk? And question is from beloved content creator / patron of everyone, Mercurio Blue. Always comes up with a banger of a question. There is one more in the refrigerator for Mercurio, so that's going to be answered later. So first of all, obviously, when you play Up the Beanstalk, there are several modes you can be playing. You can go all in on 5 drops in your deck and build some kind of a mana base that will support it. Or you can just play it as a cantripping bargain fodder and have maybe a couple of 5 mana cards that will give you this kind of extra bonus if you manage to cast them. And these are 2 very different strategies. In one of them, you don't care that much if you sacrifice your Up the Beanstalk. In the other one, you definitely want to keep Up the Beanstalk on board as long as possible, because it will be a value engine in the later game. And you should focus on being able to put Up the Beanstalk on the board while at the same time keeping up with the pace of the opposing deck. So having like cheap interaction and things like that. I took the game data because that's now available. I'm going to be talking at length about the gameplay data in the next episode. But because it's there, I did a simple analysis. I looked at the number of spells with mana value 5 or more in a deck and the win rates of the decks with Up the Beanstalk. I didn't look at the number of the Beanstalks, but most of those decks had 1 copy. There were some with 2. There was even one deck that had 5 copies of Up the Beanstalk, which I thought was a bit excessive. But I think that the general trend from there is that win rates of the decks that have 2 to 5 cards with mana value 5 or more, they were doing sort of medium at 55% win rate roughly. And then when you go across and have 6 or more of the spells with mana value 5 or more, you go up to around 57% win rate, maybe even 58 in some cases. And I think that sort of suggests that if you're playing the Beanstalk deck, you probably want to have 6 cards that will be triggered by it if you want this deck to be successful. Now, the problem with this data is, of course, it takes generic decks. So basically, there are 4 decks that will be playing up the Beanstalk in majority of the situations. There are 4 color combinations with green. Possibly there will be some 3 color decks, maybe 4 color decks that will also utilize up the Beanstalk. I didn't look at those. So no, here I did look at those, but in the next analysis, I didn't look at those. I only looked at the 2 color archetypes. And I think that not all of them are made equally. And especially the problem with the Up the Beanstalk and its general data is that a lot of people put it in your blue-green deck because blue-green sort of cares about 5 mana spells. But I think it's one of the bigger traps of the format. Those blue-green decks with Up the Beanstalk have a pretty bad win rate. And I think it's more important to maybe avoid blue-green 5 mana deck than to care about the number of cards that cost 5 mana or more in your deck. I think that the color combination that you pair your Up the Beanstalk with is pretty much important. Then maybe if you look at the black-green decks, obviously the ones with more 5 mana spells will be better. But I think it's more important if you're planning to play Up the Beanstalk is to position yourself in jaunt colors. So red, green, black, green. These have like around 56, 57% win rate, while blue, green, and white, green, they are at 53 and 54%. So I think that the most important thing is play it in the right deck. Especially, I think red-green decks with Up the Beanstalks are maybe slightly underappreciated, but there's plenty of interesting cards that you can put in those. Like one example is Hearth Elemental. That card costs 6 mana, obviously, but can be discounted quite heavily, especially when you play adventure creatures and a bunch of spells. And I think that there are red-green decks that could probably run a bazillion of those Hearth Elementals and Up the Beanstalk to support them, and you can still have like a Hamlet Glutton, and you can have maybe Agatha's Champion or something like that, and you can draw a bunch of cards, which is interesting because that increases the resilience of those kind of chunky, stompy, big monster decks, because normally what those decks are lacking is card draw power, and they run out of steam after some time. And if 2 of their big threats are dealt with, they are left with a bunch of mana dorks, and they cannot do much. If you have Up the Beanstalk in that deck, you will be able to go through your library quite rapidly, and that would mean that you will draw more of your aggressive threats. And few decks can cope with third Hamlet Glutton, as I recently started to learn by playing those decks with 3 Hamlet Gluttons and realizing just how much better it is that if they deal with the 2 of them, you play the third one and seal the deal through that. Okay, well, that concludes the listener question part of the show. So we can move on to the draft data. And draft data is pretty rich. You can do a much deeper analysis of what's going on in there. I'm only going to skim through the surface because honestly, I don't feel like having a 3-hour episode that goes super deep into the data. I wanted to make this episode relatively light so that it's easy to follow. But obviously, a lot of win rate in limited is hidden in how well you play the game. And there is no discussion about it. But especially when you're a beginner drafter, you can dramatically improve your win rate by drafting decks better. And this is much easier to learn, and this is much easier to achieve. So if you were just starting to draft and you want to get better, I think that draft portion is the part that you should focus the most, because then you will see tangible improvement very quickly. And if you do have tangible improvement very quickly, you will have, especially when you draft an arena, you will get more gems out of your drafts, which means that you will be able to draft a bit more. And if you draft a bit more, playing experience and playing are very well linked. So the more you play, the better as a player you will become. Obviously, at certain moment, you will reach obstacles in your gameplay that are linked to your philosophical inhibitions of doing something, because there is an order. People learn things when they're drafting, and for a good reason. Some concepts are easy to grasp, some concepts require a bit more experience and understanding and expertise in order to be ready for them. Like, if you give someone the first draft and you tell them that they can wheel a card and on purpose in order to get two cards for the one pick, they might not get it at first because they are not experienced. You need to introduce those concepts in a certain order. So in draft, there is plenty of concepts that are quite easy to grasp. And today, I think that I will look at a couple of cards that are good to force. And by that, I mean, these are the cards that if you first pick them, they have the highest win rate. And I'm also going to look at some cards that are maybe not so much worth to force. So cards that are pretty bad first picks. And that means they are frequently first picked, but they have a very low win rate in the drafts when you had those cards as your first pick. We're going to look at certain cards that are slight outliers in terms of the difference between when you pick them and how often you play them. So I looked at this data and I looked at what is the average place where you will pick or see the card in the draft, the ALSA. And I also looked at how do cards with different ALSA end up in your deck. And obviously you can guess that the cards that are high picks probably will end up in people's decks very frequently because they are high picks. They're probably good cards. People will go out of their way to put them in their decks. But if you have something that always wheels, it will rarely make your deck because obviously they are weak cards if they are always wheeling most of the time. And if they're weak cards, they will just not be put in the decks and that's it. Also because sometimes you just pick them and they are not even in your color because that's what was left in the booster. So clearly not going to end up in your deck. Then we're going to look at cards that we can reliably wheel. And while we're going to do it, I'm going to discuss several of those cards and give you maybe more like practical examples of what could you be doing in your draft in order to get two cards for the price of one pick, or at least speculate on them, and how to use those speculation to help you navigate through the draft and help you figure out what's being drafted around the table and what's not. And we're going to briefly touch on the topic of signals in the draft, and it's going to be mainly from purely academic idea of what you should be thinking and considering as a signal and how to maybe recognize what a signal is by looking at the 17 lens data. All right. So first part, I actually added it later because I was inspired when watching myself in heuristic studies. I decided to reevaluate what I was talking in the heuristic studies episode about cards that are differentially picked in pack 1 and pick 2 and pick 3 and pack 3. So some of the cards are going to go much later in pack 3 than in pack 1. And in the heuristic study episode, I was talking about multicolor cards. And if you look at the cards from this set, this by the number, by the way, means how many picks later they go. So if it's 1.48, it's around 1.5 pick later in pack 3 than in pack 1. So what I was saying in the heuristic study episode is that signpost uncommons are going much later in pack 3 than in pack 1. Because in pack 1, people are looking for their identity, and there is a need of finding your identity and picking up, say you pick up 2 white cards and then you see a white, red signpost uncommon, you pick it and you say, look, I might be in the white red. I already have some white cards. This is a strong card. it seems that no one close to me is drafting white-red because they would have picked it. So that's like a good indicator that this is the identity I can assume. But of course, later in the draft, you are not going to assume a new identity in third pack, which means that those cards that give you an identity in the first pack are going to be going later in the pack 3, because if you picked your lane right, you shouldn't be surrounded by people drafting your color combination. And also, like, some of those cards are hard to splash, and maybe people are weary to splash some of them. So you might be rewarded in getting them slightly later. And Greta Sweet Tooth Scourge is the card that has the biggest difference between pack 1 and pack 3. 1.5 picks, but most of them are relatively close to each other. We have Obira, Dreaming Duelist, the fairy blue-black signpost. We have Spain Troll, the rare Golgari, that comes with an aura, and you can sacrifice an aura to have it fight something. Those two go like 1.3 picks later in pack 3 than in pack 1. Charade of the Numbing Depths, the Azorius signpost, Ruby, the Gruul signpost, around 1.26, 1.20 picks, and rest of them are sort of between 115 and 1 pick difference. We have Trojan, we have Yena, we have Tottentans, we have Sir Armand, we have Niva. So these are all the multicolor cards, Likeness Looter. And we have also some cards that are not strictly multicolor. First of those, because we already know that those multicolor cards go later in pack 3 than in pack 1. But one of those cards that is on the list that is actually monocolor is Tanglespan Lookout. That's the 3-mana 2/3. It's green, and it has the ability, whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. And this is a card that, if you pick it early and you can build around and make some kind of a green X deck that has a lot of auras, you can achieve it in multiple ways. You can, for example, make it like green-white is the most obvious one, because that one has the most auras, and it also has the signpost uncommon that in Sir Armand that creates aura and gives bonus to creatures with auras. But you can, I think, make it like a green-red when you put some young hero rolls and have removal that puts auras on stuff. Thank you, Kat. I'm not calling you. I'm talking to people in the computer world. Yes, the fact that you hear to my voice doesn't mean that I'm calling you to pester me again. Thank you. Your cooperation is going to be greatly appreciated. I fed you before. I fed him before the seminar so that he doesn't bother me, but obviously that doesn't stop the cat. Anyway, you want to be on TV? Come, Scorcho. Come on TV. Yes. Say hi to TV. No. Now go. Rome. Yeah. My cat is super sweet, but obviously he thinks when I'm talking to the screen that I'm talking to him, because that's how cats operate. That's how their brain functions, and there's nothing we can do about it. He made me so proud today. Sorry for the tangent, but I was walking my dog, and my cat always follows me when I'm walking with the dog. And then he went into someone's garage, and I was chatting with the neighbor, and the cat was exploring his garage. And then I finished the chat, and I said, Scorcha, it's time to go. Let's go. And the cat just followed me, and he was very impressed that the cat is listening to me. And I do wish that my dog would do the same, but unfortunately, no such luck. I need the dog on the lead in order to get some kind of obedience from him. But okay, enough of the tangents. Let's go back to the Tanglespan Lookout. So I guess that there are several ways of building this deck, but if you pick it early, you will ramp up the auras kind of rewards, and that's why people want to pick it early in the pack 1. But of course, if you don't have any auras in your deck and it's pack 3, you won't be, even if you're in green, you will not be that keen on picking Tanglespan Lookout. So if you are sort of getting ready for the auras deck and you're hoping for payoffs, Well, you know that both Tanglespan Lookout and Sir Armand are going slightly later in pack 3. So, and also Yenna Directed Regent. So you get like at least 3 good cards for the Auras deck that will go later in pack 3, and also in pack 2 in most cases. Maybe slightly less late than in pack 3. But you, if you position yourself for that deck and you'll be lucky to be gifted with the cards, they are going to appear. Now, this, of course, creates a big problem. This is basically gambling because you don't have a guarantee of those cards being open in the later packs. And this is an important concept to get to your heads, that in any format, if you have build around the kind of archetypes that have common payoffs that are really good, the kind of common payoffs that no one else on the table will want except for people that are in this particular deck, these archetypes will be great place to try to speculate on, because you will be greatly rewarded in pack 3. And any single time we've seen the threaten affected common being good, that was exactly what was happening, that people were, first of all, asserting their position as this black-red drafter, and then pack 3, you get like a bunch of those threaten effects, and your deck comes together beautifully because no one wants those things after some time if they are pushed out of the black-red. Okay, we have a second card that is monocolored, and that's Talion's Messenger. And I don't know why, because that card is pretty good in general. You don't need like a bunch of fairies to play it, and maybe people fall into a trap of thinking that you might need to play more fairies for this card to be good. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, it's nice to play it, and on the first turn that it exists, you already get a trigger, but it's not a must. The card is good on its own, perfectly fine. I mean, and by that, it will rarely survive longer than 2 turns, but if you get one hit, it's fine. And if it's a magnet for removal, that's also good, because that means that other things that you're going to have are going to live. And after that, we have Harmflame Duelist, which is sort of a multicolor card, but I was quite happy to play it as a red card with maybe like a Crystal Grotto as a way of casting it as a creature once in a while. I found it fine as a 3-mana deal 3 damage to any target spell is all right still. And a weird one, Land Tax. And I don't know why people pick it earlier in pack 1, because I checked it is more or less people pick it earlier in pack 1. I guess that they try to build around it. I didn't go too deep on looking how good are those build arounds with Land Tax. But my guess would be not that good. I do appreciate the sentiment of trying to play those decks, though. So, it's not only about the win rate, it's also about having fun when you play the drafts. And if Land Tax can create fun games, by all means do that. And then I looked at the cards that are going earlier, earlier in pack 3. So you can get them quite easy in pack 1, but not in pack 3. And here I found a new kind of trend. I didn't see it in the previous set's data, but there is a bunch of rare drafting, especially of those unplayable rares from the enchantment slot. We have Blood Moon, we have Leyline of Sanctity, Mana Flare, Sneak Attack, Leyline of Abundance, Rest in Peace, Phyrexian Unlife, Leyline of Lightning, and all these cards are stone cold unplayables. But hey, if I see a pack and there's nothing for me in it, I'm already in my deck. I'm probably already good on playables. I can hate pick something from another person. See, I'm trying to put it not as a greed. I'm putting it as an altruism kind of pick. Instead of picking someone, a card from someone that will be good in their deck, you sacrifice yourself and you pick this rare, collect 20 gems, and move on with your life. It's a very smart thing to do. I guess that's going to happen in those kind of sets that have unplayables slot of those extra type of cards with a high rarity. It's funny to see how prevalent they are. But apart from the cards that are unplayable, and we have also like a bunch of other ones, Ground Seal, Nature's Will, Polluted Bonds, Leyline of the Void, Smothering Tide, we have 2 cards that are definitely playable and confirm the heuristics I was talking about in the heuristic study episode. And one of them is Evolving Wilds, and the other one is Crystal Grotto. Fixing, there's not so much colorless fixing in this set. These are the only proper two ones. There's also Chromatic Prism. My brain is dead. You know what I'm talking about. But Crystal Grotto and Evolving Wilds are excellent land fixing solutions, and they go much earlier in pack 3, which means that if you're having this deck and you think, you know what, could use Prophetic Prism. Thank you very much. If you're using this deck, having this deck, and you think, oh, it would be great to have some fixing, I'll wait till pack 3 and I'll pick some Evolving Wilds or Crystal Grotto. This is a tricky strategy because you have to pick them much earlier in the pack 3, earlier by 1 pick on average, which is quite a lot. And if you would go a bit further in this graph and move beyond the Smothering Tide at around 0.8 picks earlier in pack 3, you would also find the Edge Wall in somewhere here, which it's also going slightly earlier in pack 3. So all the fixing, and I think Prophetic Prism also is in that category, will go slightly earlier in pack 3. So I would say it's a smart thing to use your first pack to sort of focus on that fixing if you see it and get ready for the fixing. And then in pack 3, you can focus on getting rewards, because especially in this format, when splashing is relatively trivial, honestly, you can reap quite a lot of rewards, because of course you don't have a guarantee of getting a Fondsbane Troll. But if after the first 2 packs your deck is ready for splashing almost anything, because you have a bunch of green fixing spells and a Prophetic Prism and maybe an Evolving Wilds, you don't really mind if it's going to be a Fondsbane Troll, or if it's going to be Yenna Red Tooth Regent, or if it's going to be Niva Stalked by Nightmares. You can pick it, and you can pick it probably quite late. So you can have the first 3 picks that are going to go perfectly into your deck, and then later you can opportunistically get your Greta Sweet Tooth Scourge or your Charade of Numbing Depths, depending on how your deck looks like, and put them in your deck, because they're still powerful cards, and you can get them slightly later. But that can only happen if you already have the fixing in place, and it's easier to get the fixing in the pack 1. Right. Now, I told you that I'm going to be talking about the odds of making the deck depending on ALSA. So in this graph, we have ALSA here. The higher the number for ALSA, the later the card goes. So if ALSA equals 1, the card never wheels. And then I calculated the probability of being played when picked. And I think this is only data for common cards. I didn't want to mix different rarities, because it makes this graph dog's breakfast because of the ALSA 1 kind of cards, which is problematic. And this is only commons. This one is, I guess, Candy Grapple, for example, if I remember correctly. And there is like a pretty good linear trend. So if your ALSA is around, I don't know, 3, 4, you will play those cards more or less 80% of the time that you pick them, based on the data. If your ALSA is like 6, you'll play those cards around 40-50% of the time that you pick them. So obviously this should inform you in a way. You shouldn't just like, oh, I'm going to play this card because I didn't play it last time and it has a low ALSA, so I have to play it right now. It's not a conscious choice, but it's a trend that you might know. So you should know that if you pick like a low ALSA card, the chance of it becoming a part of your deck is slightly lower. So, maybe it's worth speculating on like card that is hard to get, instead of picking like a medium playable, because you know that medium playable is only a 50-50 of the card in your deck, because even if you stay in that particular color, you're likely not to be able to fit it in your deck, because you're going to get better cards. So this is the kind of a choice between sticking to one lane and maybe making some of those speculative picks. I have lots of decks that I played in this format where I end up with a Candy Grapple here and there, or Torture Tower. And sometimes I don't play them. Sometimes I even splash them if I think that it's worth it. But if I see like pack 1, pick 6, Torch the Tower, almost guarantee I'm going to pick it, because Torch the Tower is a great card, and if I see it pack 1, pick 6, there is a good chance that maybe red is not drafted on the table. And if it's not drafted on the table, I'm super happy to pivot from any other color that I had. Let's say I have like 2 green cards and 4 black cards, 3 black cards. I see Torch the Tower, I pick it, and all of a sudden my green is very likely in danger of being cut because I have a really, really good card in Torch the Tower. And if green keeps on flowing and black keeps on flowing, it's fine. I'm willing to sacrifice that 1 pick. And if I have a deck that can easily splash Torch the Tower, I'm totally going to do it. So yeah, that's how you can use this kind of data in strategizing whether it's worth to pick a medium card in your colors or maybe a very good card outside of your colors. And it's obviously you can do that kind of choices without data. It's maybe nice to know the odds. But when I looked at this graph, I saw one thing, and that is that there are a couple of clusters of cards that are straying away from the main trend line in here. And I decided to take a little peek on those cards. And it's funny how my laser looks very much like a data point. Hey, let's make an outlier here. No. I first looked at those 3 cards because they looked that they are played less than it would come from that curve. So despite having a pretty low alsa, they are played slightly less than other cards with the similar alsa would be played. And I was wondering why. And then I saw that all 3 of those cards are black removal spells. We have Candy Grapple, Feed the Cauldron, and Shatter the Oath, which sort of means that either people pick speculative removal and don't play it, like I was saying I'm doing myself with Torch the Tower, or that even picking black cards early is not a guarantee of having that color open in the pod. Now, this data comes probably from the first 3 weeks of the drafts, because that's where the draft data was released. Maybe by now you will see red cards that are having the same trend, that you pick an early cut in, but red is going to be very cut. No pun intended there. And you will not be able to play those red decks. So maybe that changed right now. It would be interesting to see it, but of course the draft data was not updated since then. But it's worth knowing that picking those black removal spells does not guarantee playing them as much as it should based on where the alsa is. But at the same time, I saw that there is a bunch of cards here that are played more frequently than you would expect, given their alsa, which means that picking those cards is a pretty good guarantee that they are going to be in your deck. And then I looked at what those cards were, and there is a pattern there as well. You have Evolving Wilds, Crystal Grotto, and Brave the Wilds. And maybe not a pattern, but you have a Grand Bold Guest, a card that is picked probably way too late, and that's why. But it's good to know that the fixing that you pick is more likely to make your deck in this format, even if it's a colored fixing like Brave the Wilds. We're going to be talking about Brave the Wilds in a second when we're going to discuss wheeling, because I had a very good question pertaining to one of my decks. I might even do a pause in the seminar and give you practical examples of that, or maybe we can do it after. All right, so black removal has a lower guarantee of being played in your decks than other cards with the similar kind of pick prioritization. Fixing will make your deck more frequently than the cards with the similar way of prioritization. Grand Bull Guest is an outlier that I think is played more frequently than it should, because it's lower evaluation by the general population. So I think it goes way too late for what it should be going. Okay, then I decided to look at different data. I looked at the cards that are best first picks. And by best first picks, I mean cards that when they are first picks are frequently played. So like over 80% of the time they will make it into your main deck, and they will also have a high win rate. And we have a bunch of rares here, obviously. Number one is Realm Scorcher Hellkite, the 6-mana dragon with bargain. Number two, we have Red Cup Gutter Dweller, a card that I've played 0 times, but it looks sweet, and I would want to play it, because why wouldn't you? That's the... Is it 5-mana 3/3 that comes with 2 rats, and then you can sacrifice rats to sort of draw cards. And it has menace, obviously. But we also have some cards of lower rarity. So just behind those two, unarguably bombs, number 3 on the list is actually High Fae Negotiator. That if you pick it as your first pick, it has 63% win rate. Now, I want to stress that this might be an outlier, but it may not be outlier as well. So it's nice to at least consider that it might be a very good first pick. 63% is really high. However, I also checked the same numbers for pack 3 pick 1, and High Fae Negotiator had a much lower win rate when it was picked then. While Red Cup Gutter Dweller and Realm Scorcher Hellkite still had very high win rate, even if you pick them in pack 3. I did it as a sort of control to those conclusions, basically trying to figure out if there are some trends. After that, we have Huntsman Redemption. That's the 3-mana saga that makes a 3/3 beast. And by the way, that beast in paper has a fantastic token. I'd recommend collecting them. With 62% win rate. And then we have another couple of uncommons, Tough Cookie and Witchstalker Frenzy. Obviously, Tough Cookie, the 2/2 that can animate artifacts into 4/4s, and Witchstalker's Frenzy, 4-mana, deal 5, but gets a discount for each attacking creature. So you can attack, or you can use it defensively when opponent is attacking you, and cast it for as little as 1 mana to deal 5 damage, which is a great deal. Those are oscillating around 62%. And then we have another collection of rares: Heartflame Duelist, Virtue of Loyalty, Spellbook Vendor. But we also have Torch the Tower, we have Lord Skitter's Butcher at the lower rarities, and we also get Imodane's Recruiter at 60%, also from those lower rarity cards. Now, interestingly, Imodane's Recruiter is the mythic uncommon for the set, but it doesn't have the highest win rate as the first pick from all the lower rarity cards. There is a bunch of them in between, including even a common that has a better win rate than Recruiter as the first pick. Still, I would probably pick the Recruiter. It has an immense ceiling as a card. But you probably shouldn't be forcing it blindly, because it can lead to mediocre decks with a Recruiter. That's maybe the trap. While Torch the Tower has a high floor and decent ceiling, and that's the difference between those two cards. And other couple of bombs. Questing Druid is probably better than most people think as a card, especially when you pick it first. I would highly recommend playing it in a blue-red deck as the only green thing. It's great there because you actually want the adventure side of the Questing Druid. So exile 2 cards and you can play them until end of next turn. And then if you have a couple of green sources, you can actually cast it quite early, and then most of your spells will be triggering its ability to grow. So opponent will have a small window of time to kill it with efficient removal, and after that it's going to be a 2-drop that requires like a solid removal. And Decadent Dragon and Gumdrop Poisoner are another 2 rares on the list of the super high picks. But of course, if there are like really high win rate first picks, there are also low win rate first picks. And I didn't even think about reasons why those things are there. Some of them might be due to some kind of variance. It's based on not that many drafts. So I picked only cards that were first picked 50 or more times, but it's only 50 or more times, which means maybe 300 games for each of those. Um, but the worst first pick from that data set was Sentinel of Lost Lore, the 3 mana, 3/4 thing that can return something from adventure and shuffle something that is on opponent's adventure. 47.5% win rate. Now, this is pretty low for a card that you're first picking. And I guess the problem with that card is that it's really heavy and green because you need to be like 10 forests, 11 forests in order to be reliably playing it on turn 3. And it's very vague in what it's doing. So it's going to be probably the best in some kind of Timur adventures chassis. Those decks don't always come together. It's not particularly great in green black, which I think is my favorite green combination in this format. It's not that great in green white, so it limits you to what you want to be playing in a way. Like it limits you to playing a heavy green deck and having lots of adventure things that you can recoup. And possibly because of that, it has the slow win rate. Actually, when I looked at the data from pack 3, it had a pretty reasonable win rate then. So once you know that you want the card like that, you're probably going to pick it in pack 3 and be happy keeping it in your deck. But maybe as a first pick, it puts you in a sort of awkward position for the rest of the draft. And this very same situation with the Pollen Shield Hair. That's the 2 mana, 2/2 in white. It gives +1/+1 to token creatures, and it has an adventure that gives target creature +1/+1 for each creature you control, plus some kind of evasion, I guess. This card also has a pretty good win rate when it's picked in the third pack, but not very good when you pick it in the first pack. It possibly also puts you on a trajectory of playing white-green because that's probably the deck that has the best kind of token theme. And also because it's white-green itself, and that's not such a great trajectory that you want to force it, but it's probably a good trajectory when you're already in it, and if you want to actively pick it and put it in your deck. Some other cards, Hilda of the Icy Crown. Again, it's probably that I made even a Twitter thread based on that card that I called the Tragedy of the Mythics. And I speculated that those rare and mythic build around cards, they have an eternal problem that you don't want to first pick them because those build arounds are not good enough to force them. It would be great if you could pick them late, but because of how arena economy works, you will never see them late on arena. So unfortunately, you'll only be able to play those cards in MTGO if they are worth like 0 ticks, because then people will just pass them, and the chair that wants them will get them as a reward. And arena economy in this particular case is making the draft experience a bit less, because you would want to be playing those drafts when people don't care that Hilda is a useless mythic that will never be played in anything, and they will just let you they will just pass it around the table, and because of that, certain decks will all of a sudden be possible, and those decks are very difficult to do in the current economy when you have to first pick it and basically gamble that you will get enough payoffs, and the right colors will be open in your pod, and they really need to be open in order to be successful. A couple of other things there. Talion, the Kindly Lore, and Fairy Fencing are there, and Likeness Looter. So which points me to the idea that forcing fairies is not such a great idea as well. That probably it's also one of those decks that you need to sort of be in the right seat and get those rewards later, which means again that most likely I will recommend drafting the fairy deck more in something like MTGO rather than on Arena, because of how economy works and how you can get those cards as rewards. And again, not force them because you got Italian in your pack 1, but rather start drafting black see that the blue is open, and boom, there you go. It's a much better way of entering this kind of deck. And we see a couple of other cards that are sort of build-arounds. We see Ariet of the Charmed Apple, Imodane the Pyrohammer, Yena Red Tooth Regent, Archon of the Wild Rose. All those cards are sort of this rare build-arounds, and as first picks, they don't have a good win rate. And possibly some of it is because people force them even when the actual archetype is not open. And there is a lesson somewhere there that you can even first pick those cards, but don't stick to them. Like, I drafted Hilda of the Icy Crown once in the set. Obviously, I took it as a first pick because where else would I see it? But I think after like pack 1, pick 5, I just started picking red because I saw it slightly open, and I didn't see good enough payoffs for the Hilda. In the end, I ended up drafting white-red aggro with 3 Modern Recruiters, and it trophied very easily, and Hilda never saw anything else than being in the sideboard. So there you go. I just abandoned it very easily. And it's not that I got 3 Recruiters in pack 1, I got them in pack 2 and 3. But I got the first one as, I think, pack 1, pick 4 or something like that. And that sort of made me at least pick the right card and pivot away from the tappy tap archetype, and there was nothing in it. And I'm pretty sure that the tappy tap archetype comes together once, maybe 10, maybe 15 drafts if you pick Hilda as your first pick, and that means that 14 drafts you're going to end up with a mediocre deck, and that probably is what reflects in the win rate, which, again, to those that don't listen to me very frequently, 50% win rate for 17 lens users, that's very low because the average is 56. Some other cards that are probably worth mentioning in here, Witch's Vanity, not a great first pick. Again, this is probably the card that you should be getting for reward for being in black in the later part. You don't want to be first picking it, maybe. Miguelito Hertz is saying Archon. I regret picking Archon first many times, but why is it so bad? I think that part of what makes it maybe bad is just generally white-green is not that good. And the other part is that people, including the host here, tend to try to lean too hard on the aura synergies, while it's probably just perfectly serviceable as a 4/4 flyer. And then if you have a couple of auras, that's fine. It's going to be doing better. So I think maybe the idea is to play it in as a sort of top-end creature in controlling decks. That's one thing. As a sort of like attrition decks where you can reliably make it the last thing standing. It can lead to some nasty blowouts when you attack with your alleged 4/4s in the air, and Archon dies, and then all of a sudden all your creatures die. So there is always a risk of that happening. Ingenious Prodigy. There was a question about that card, that it's surprising that it's there. I think that this is another warning against going too aggressively into blue. I think blue is great in this format, but before I go into blue, I want to at least test the environment and check if the blue cards that I want to be see being passed are being passed, and that includes Ingenious Prodigy. That's the blue and X for an 0/1 that comes into play with X +1/+1 counters, and you can remove them each turn in order to draw an extra card. Also has Skulk for some weird reason. I've played that card multiple times, but I never first picked it. I always sort of saw it maybe, like pick 4 or something, especially when blue was a bit underdrafted. It is perfectly splashable, and frequently I played it in decks that had a couple of blue cards, and that was one of those. But yes, I don't think that it's a good idea to go into those control decks where it would be the best before you see that there looks to be a feasible scenario to get on those decks, because those decks are weaker in the format in general. They have a lower win rate, And because they have a lower win rate, you might not go gang-ho on trying to get them, because that's not what you want to be doing in this format. If you can get an aggressive deck, try to get an aggressive deck. But if you see that a good version of control might be open because you see certain telltale cards that will be working in that archetype, then you can start thinking about those ingenious prodigies, and not before. My surprise on the list is Utopia Sprawl. But I guess that it just shows that Utopia Sprawl is a good helper in the deck. It's not a thing on its own, and you probably shouldn't be picking it super highly as a pick one. You probably have a better card in your pack, and if you don't, well, unlucky. All right. So the last topic that we're going to talk about is wheeling. And this is a curve I made based on the WOE data, but that looks at the Funderwung says Sprawl has like a 70% opening hand win rate. Yes, it does, but it doesn't have an impressive drawn win rate, and you're going to draw it in the late game much more frequently than in the opening hand. And also, there is a difference between getting a Sprawl in your deck and first picking a Sprawl to be in your deck. You'd rather first pick like a more powerful card that will actually give meaning to putting a Sprawl in your deck, in my opinion. But again, it's on the end of that spectrum, so it's probably not far from the middle card on that list. Anyway, last topic of the day. It's about wheeling, and this is a nice curve I made by linking alpha of cards and the probability that this card is going to wheel if you opened it in pack one. And from that curve, you can see that obviously the later the card goes, the bigger the chance of wheeling. And also it has this kind of sigmoid curve, which means it starts flat, starts growing, grows in a linear way for some time, and then starts flattening out as it comes to the end. And from that linear stage, you can sort of get good estimates of what are the odds of the card wheeling when you open it. So if a card has an alpha of 4, you can look here, and you can see that it's roughly 15% chance that this card is going to wheel. If a card has an alpha of 5, you look here, roughly 30%, maybe 32%, so roughly 1/3 chance that the card is wheeling if it has alpha of 5. 6 goes somewhere here, and it's like 47% chance that this card wheels on average. And then if you go to 7, we are approaching like 2/3 chance of wheeling. So like alpha 4, 1/3 of wheeling, alpha 7, 2/3 of the wheeling, and then in between you get in between values. And this is a very useful curve to know. I have repeated that curve time after time for every set, and it looks more or less similar. So if you have that curve, and there is, I think there is my article on MTGA Zone strictly about wheeling. You can find it quite easily if you go to MTGA Zone and look through my articles. When you have that curve, not only for pick 1, but also for pick 2, pick 3, pick 4, and pick 5, and you can sort of look at the probabilities of wheeling in those scenarios if you're interested. But a rule of thumb: alpha 4, 1/3, alpha 7, 2/3 probability of wheeling is something that might be useful for you to know at the back of your head. And of course, then you need to just basically check alpha. And I have selected some juicy cards that you can use for wheeling. Now, keep in mind, maybe the alpha of some of those cards has shifted in the wrong direction because people are better equipped to understand that those are good cards. But I looked at the cards that have 30%, roughly 30% probability of wheeling according to this data. And I have 3 of those on the list. Hopeless Nightmare, great card, and very useful in almost every black deck that I've been playing so far. And it still has a 30% of wheeling. Monstrous Rage, the combat trick, 30% probability of wheeling, and Hatching Plans, the do nothing card from the enchantment slot. That is great and also has around 30% of wheeling. How can you use it practically? Well, you can Open a pack, there is a Candy Grapple, and there is Torch the Tower. And I evaluate those two cards roughly the same at this current stage. But I don't see anything good in red in that pack, but I do see Hopeless Nightmare. And if I think, well, look, there's actually 30% chance that that Hopeless Nightmare will return to me. And this way, I'm going to pick like a good combo because I have the Hopeless Nightmare for turn one. And then later in the game, I can just sacrifice it to my Candy Grapple, bargain it away, and get some scrying. I'm in for that kind of deal. And the fact that I'm picking not between Candy Grapple and Torch the Tower, but I'm picking between Candy Grapple and 30% of the Hopeless Nightmare and Torch the Tower, that's a big different choice for me. The fact that I'm having this kicker of having this roughly 1/3 of chance of getting extra Hopeless Nightmare is going to sway me to pick the Candy Grapple in that situation, even if I evaluate those cards as relative equals. And you can think about the same, like you see an aggressive card in the pack and there's a monstrous rage, and you should be able to sort of like, if the pack is super weak, you're probably more likely that this monstrous rage is going to disappear. If there is absolute garbage in the pack and you see this Hopeless Nightmare, it probably won't wheel to you. But if you see like a strong powered pack, you can increase your confidence that this Hopeless Nightmare is going to wheel. So you can sort of bet on it. And same with Hatching Plans, you pick some kind of a bargain card, and then that would be technically good in some kind of a X blue control archetype. Again, Candy Grapple, perfect example. And you sort of speculate this Hatching Plans to wheel. Now, Hatching Plan in blue black is a very important card, and you really want to have a copy. So if you can create a situation when you're going to first pick the black card, then you're going to draft sort of hard way, maybe leaning to black. And 9 picks later or 8 picks later, if you see those Hatching Plans returning, you sort of know that probably no one on the table is super interested in drafting blue controlish kind of deck. And you get those Hatching Plans, which are amazing in those decks. So you sort of probe the environment. You don't need to go all in on drafting this blue-black deck. You can sort of send this Hatching Plans on the trip around the table in order to sort of test the grounds if your blue-black strategy might be open. And if it comes back, yay. If it doesn't come back, you're still left with your Candy Grapple, which you're happy with. Maybe you can go and start and draft like some kind of a black-green deck, and it's all fine. So you are sort of like hedging your bets. And I don't know. You're not manipulating the table because you don't have an impact on what people are picking, but sort of probing the table, testing the waters. And if the waters are ripe for the blue Dimir control, great, because it's a fun deck to play. Right. Then some tasty wheel targets that wheel 50% of the time. Twisted Fealty is a card that is overperforming in this set. That's the gain control of target creature until end of turn and gains haste variant for the set. Around 50% chance of wheeling in pack one. And again, here I can imagine multiple scenarios when I will pick a card that will be in a deck that will be good with Twisted Fealty. Let's say I'm picking some kind of a strong red card that would be good in the aggressive deck. Song of Tottentons. Or maybe even some red bomb, or maybe like a Lord Skitter's Butcher. And if I pick Lord Skitter's Butcher, I'm sort of telling myself I'm probably most likely want to be red-black. And I put this Twisted Fealty on the trip around the table. If it comes back, great. It's going to be a great addition to my aggressive go wide rat deck that I'm potentially drafting if I'm in that scenario. Another card, Rat Out. Around 50% probability of wheeling. Great removal. You don't always have to put it in your deck, but it's usually pretty good. It's also good as a combat trick. So better than 1 mana deal 1 damage to something, because the -1/-1 is a real thing when you're trading. Also generates a body at instant speed, so maybe some celebration can be triggered through rat out, surprisingly. So yeah, altogether a good card, and you can also send it on the trip around the table, 50%, especially if you want to draft red black and you want to put rat outs in it. You can test the grounds, and if it comes back, then there is a good shout that people are not super keen on rats. And the last card on that list of the over 50%, Spell Stutter, the counter spell that is good with fairies, but you don't even need fairies to play it. You might need only a couple of them to make it relevant to late game, and it's going to be a great card in your deck, and quite important one in a Dimir control or something, and you can wheel it 50% of the time. And in my case, 0, because I let it go around the table multiple times, never comes back. But the data says half of the time does come back, just not for me. Oh, there's a typo in this slide. It should say over 70% or around 70%. These are the tasty wheel targets that wheel roughly 70% of the time. And here we have Ice Out, an absolutely crucial card for any blue controlling deck. It's important because it's one of the few good bargain cards. And of course, if you're playing a blue control deck, you definitely want to be playing Hatching Plans in it. So you might want to max out on those bargain cards. Ice Out is perfect for that because it also offers an effect that you do want to have in that deck, possibly in a couple of copies, and that's a counter spell. Because at a certain moment, you're going to stabilize the board. If you are to win any game, you will have to work hard on stabilizing. Those blue decks are not going to win early games in most cases. But then, of course, if you stabilize, you can still be killed by an instant sorcery that you cannot do anything about. And Ice Out is a great card to make sure that you feel in control of the game, because you will then be able to make decisions. Okay, this can live. I'm not going to counter it. I can deal with it. This is a must kill, and I have to counter it. Having access to that option of being able to counter anything at any time is amazing. And in some games, you're just going to counter anything to draw 3 cards in order that you don't miss your land drops, and you can continue having a stable board through that. Another card, Brave the Wilds, a very important card in the splashing deck. I recently posted a trophy list that had 3 of those and another one that had 4 of those. And I got a question on Twitter from someone, is like, how highly are you picking those Brave the Wilds if you're getting decks with like 3-4 copies of those cards in them? And I actually never thought I'm picking them highly, but just in case, I checked in that particular draft, when did I pick the Brave the Wilds? And then I saw that it was pick 12 in first pack, pick 8 in the second pack, and pick 13 in the third pack, which means I absolutely didn't prioritize those cards, because I think that you will end up with bad decks if you are starting to pick Brave the Wilds high in this format. The whole point of drafting those decks is when you notice that those Brave the Wilds are wheeling, deep wheeling. Then you can start pick the first one speculatively, and then you can start picking more of them as they go late, because you know that they're going to go late because the first one went late, so no one is clearly interested in the card. So don't force those fixing cards in this format, at least not early. Later in the deck, when you started to draft a multicolor soup and you don't have any fixing, by all means pick them very highly. But a perfect draft to draft the multicolor decks is the one that lets you pick them late. That's the whole point. That's where you should go for those multicolor decks. If you don't see them late, you probably shouldn't be drafting a super multicolor deck. You probably should be focusing on drafting a more streamlined, maybe, like 2 colors and splash kind of deck, but not like 5-color madness. And the last card on the list is Flick the Coin, because that's just a great card and it wheeled 70% of the time. I do sincerely hope that since the data on the draft was put into the public data repositories, it's picked much more highly, and it doesn't wheel 70% of the time anymore. However, not a single draft when I was drafting red that I had a problem in accessing this card during the draft portion. And the card is truly great, does so many good things, and in some cases can be such a blowout. both in terms of aggressive decks or defensive decks. It will do something amazing almost every game. And the floor on it is 1 damage to the face, make a treasure, draw a card, which is all fine in the long run of it. Okay. And again, all those cards, you can do the similar things. You can pick a multicolor card that would be a good nucleus of some kind of a multicolor soup deck, and put the Brave the Wilds on the round trip of the table. If no one picks it, you have a very good signal. You can pick a good black removal and in a pack that has Ice Out, and see if the Ice Out wheels. If it wheels, you pick it. You can actually think about drafting a blue-black control deck. The problem with those two cards, and here we're going to touch a bit on the idea of the signals, is this. If you see Hatching Plants wheel, that's a good signal because it happens frequently enough for that to be a relevant signal, but it doesn't happen too frequently. Like if it wheels 100% of the time, it wouldn't be a signal. It's just something that happens. Even if it like wheels 50% of the time, it's a coin flip that it happens. So it might be just by pure chance, or it might be because of some trend. But if it wheels only 30% of the time, you have like a decent idea that this is not something that's happening in every draft. And so because of that, cards that have roughly 30% chance of wheeling in a particular situation are decent signals. But when you go to 50%, that will happen so frequently that it might be just stochastic effect. And if it happens like 70% of the time, like in case of those ones, despite what the graph what the slide says, it is 7%. It's not very much of a signal because that happens like 70% of the time. So, happens frequently. You shouldn't put too much weight to that information. You can abuse it. You see at least that no one is picking the Brave the Wilds early, and it's a signal in its own right that you know that there are no like Brave the Wilds aficionados on the pod. But it's not a signal that, oh, it's so surprising that I saw Brave the Wilds wheel, because it will happen all the time. Okay. With that, big thanks to 17 Lands team, who are continuously doing amazing things, and without whom I would not exist as a content creator. So I am grateful for that. I do enjoy my content creation, despite strain on my voice that it will pose after today. And thanks to Fake Jake Brown for releasing this in the podcast form, hopefully soon. And as we're on the topic of the podcast, thanks to SSCO and Mana Junkie, who are responsible for the music I am using as the intro. And thanks to the patrons and MTGA Zone for the support of the show. That keeps me motivated. Remember, data analysis takes a bloody lot of time and a lot of effort. So if you feel like giving a bit back, it would be awesome if I could get a couple of more new patrons to support me. So thanks for that. And I'll see you next week.